In the heat of battle, when death whispers your name and the sky becomes your enemy, some warriors find something far more dangerous than fear. They find joy. Captain Maria Santos discovered this truth 30,000 feet above enemy territory, when what should have been her final moment became the beginning of a legend that would echo through military history for decades. What happens when a single Apache helicopter pilot, outnumbered and outgunned, faces down 3 enemy fighter jets with nothing but skill, instinct, and a laugh that would haunt the survivors forever? This is not just a story of survival. It's the true account of the day the hunter became the hunted, and how one woman's laughter became the last sound 3 pilots would ever hear. The mission was supposed to be routine. The outcome was anything but ordinary. The desert heat shimmered like liquid mercury across the tarmac as Captain Maria Santos performed her pre-flight checks on the AH-Airs 64 Apache helicopter. The morning sun painted the sky in shades of amber and gold, but beneath the beauty lay the tension that always preceded a mission into hostile territory. Maria's hands moved with practiced precision across the aircraft systems, each switch and gauge telling her a story she had learned to read like her own heartbeat. At 28 years old, Maria had already earned a reputation as one of the most skilled helicopter pilots in the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, known as the Night Stalkers. Her colleagues respected her technical expertise. But what truly set her apart was an almost supernatural calm under pressure. Where other pilots felt fear, Maria felt focus. Where others saw danger, she saw opportunity. Her weapons systems officer, Lieutenant Jake Morrison, climbed into the front seat of the Apache. Jake was a quiet man from Montana, steady as granite and twice as reliable. He had flown with Maria on 17 previous missions, and their partnership had become legendary within their squadron. They communicated with the kind of wordless understanding that only comes from shared danger and mutual trust. The mission briefing had been straightforward. Intelligence indicated that a high-value terrorist leader was planning to move through a mountain pass approximately 200 kilometers southeast of their forward operating base. The window of opportunity would be narrow. Satellite imagery suggested the convoy would traverse the exposed section of road between noon and 2 in the afternoon. Maria and Jake's job was to provide close air support for a special forces team positioned to intercept. What the briefing had not mentioned was the recent increase in enemy air activity in the region. 3 days earlier, reconnaissance had spotted what appeared to be military aircraft operating from a hidden airfield somewhere in the mountainous terrain. The intelligence was sketchy at best. Reports of fast-moving aircraft, possibly fighters, but no concrete identification or location data. As Maria lifted off from the dusty landing zone, she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with taking an Apache into combat. The helicopter responded to her touch like a living thing, its twin engines providing the power to transform from a stationary machine into a predator capable of incredible lethality. Below them, the landscape shifted from sandy desert to rocky hills, then gradually to the rugged mountains where their target waited. The flight to the operation area took 90 minutes, during which Maria and Jake maintained radio contact with the ground team and monitored enemy communications frequencies. The Special Forces soldiers had been in position since before dawn, hidden among the rocks overlooking the narrow valley road. Their leader, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, reported clear skies and no sign of the expected convoy. Maria positioned the Apache behind a ridgeline, using the terrain to mask their presence while maintaining a clear line of sight to the target area. This was the part of the mission she enjoyed most. The patient hunter's wait, when every sense was heightened and every decision could mean the difference between success and disaster. The Apache hovered silently, its senses scanning the approaches to the valley, while Maria's eyes swept the horizon for any sign of movement. At 12:37, Rodriguez's voice crackled through their headsets. 3 vehicles had appeared on the northern approach to the valley. 2 pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns flanking a larger vehicle that matched the description of their target. Maria felt her pulse quicken as she maneuvered the Apache into attack position, the helicopter's nose dipping slightly as she aligned the targeting systems. Jake's voice was calm and professional as he acquired the targets through the Apache's sophisticated sensor sweep. The lead vehicle was moving faster than expected, apparently aware that the open stretch of road represented a vulnerability. Maria calculated angles and distances, her mind automatically compensating for wind speed, target movement, and the complex ballistics of the Hellfire missiles mounted beneath the Apache's stub wings. The first missile launch was textbook perfect. The Hellfire streaked away from the Apache with a trail of white smoke, its laser guidance system locked onto the lead escort vehicle. The explosion sent a pillar of fire and debris into the clear mountain air, and the convoy immediately scattered. The target vehicle veered off the road, seeking cover behind a cluster of boulders, while the remaining escort truck began laying down suppressive fire in the general direction of the hidden Special Forces team. Maria banked the Apache sharply to the left, bringing the helicopter's 30mm chain gun to bear on the second escort vehicle. The gun fired with a sound like industrial machinery, each round capable of penetrating light armor. The pickup truck disintegrated under the withering fire, its fuel tank exploding in a secondary blast that sent burning debris across the rocky landscape. But as Jake prepared to engage the primary target vehicle with a second Hellfire missile, his instruments began screaming warnings. 3 new contacts had appeared on radar, approaching fast from the east. The signatures were unmistakable: fighter aircraft, probably jets, moving at speeds that suggested they were already in attack formation. She dropped the Apache toward the valley floor, using the rugged terrain to break up the helicopter's radar signature while maintaining enough altitude to retain maneuverability. The enemy fighters were still several kilometers away, but at their closure rate, she had perhaps 2 minutes before they would be in weapons range. The mission parameters had just changed dramatically. What had been a routine close air support operation had suddenly become a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Maria and Jake as the hunted. The Special Forces team on the ground could provide covering fire against infantry, but they were helpless against fast-moving aircraft. The nearest friendly air support was over an hour away. Jake's voice was tight with concentration as he worked his instruments, trying to gather intelligence on the approaching threats. The radar signatures suggested MiG P-29 fighters, probably flown by experienced pilots based on their formation discipline and approach vector. These were not the kind of aircraft that should have been operating in this region, which meant that either intelligence had seriously underestimated enemy capabilities, or Maria and Jake had stumbled into something much larger than a simple terrorist interdiction. Maria made her decision in the span of a heartbeat. Running would mean abandoning the Special Forces team to whatever forces remained from the shattered convoy, and the Apache was too slow to outrun fighter jets in open terrain. Fighting would give them a chance, albeit a slim one, to complete their mission and possibly survive the encounter. The Apache was designed to be a tank killer, not an air-to-air fighter, but Maria had trained for this exact scenario in countless simulator sessions. She pulled the Apache into a tight ascending spiral, gaining altitude while keeping the helicopter's nose pointed toward the approaching fighters. The key would be to force them into the kind of close-range engagement where the Apache's superior maneuverability and heavy armor might provide an advantage. Fighter jets were designed to kill from a distance with sophisticated missiles. If she could deny them that advantage, she might have a chance. The first enemy fighter appeared as a silver glint against the blue sky, followed quickly by his wingman. They were flying in a loose finger formation, probably planning to make a single high-speed pass before climbing back to altitude for a second attack. Maria watched them approach, calculating angles and timing with the cold precision that had made her one of the most feared helicopter pilots in the theater. At 8 kilometers range, the lead fighter launched 2 missiles. Maria saw the white contrails streaking toward her position and immediately threw the Apache into a violent evasive maneuver, dropping chaff and flares while diving toward a narrow canyon that offered some protection from the incoming weapons. The first missile passed harmlessly overhead, confused by the chaff cloud, but the second was tracking true. Maria pulled the Apache through a maneuver that would have been impossible for a fixed-wing aircraft, using the helicopter's ability to change direction almost instantaneously. The missile passed close enough that she could see its fins as it streaked past, detonating against the canyon wall in a shower of rock and flame. As the fighters roared overhead, completing their first attack run, Maria brought the Apache back to a hover and locked her targeting system onto the trailing aircraft. The range was extreme for the Apache's air-to-air missiles, but she had a brief window of opportunity as the fighter pilot began his climb back to altitude. The Stinger missile leaped away from its rail beneath the Apache's wing, its heat-seeking warhead immediately acquiring the fighter's exhaust signature. Maria watched the weapon's track, holding her breath as the missile closed the distance to its target. The explosion was brilliant against the mountain sky, and the fighter's debris rained down across the valley in burning fragments. 1 down, 2 to go. But the surviving pilots had learned from their wingman's mistake. They were climbing to altitude, probably planning to use their superior speed and weapons range to engage from a distance where the Apache couldn't fight back. Maria needed to change the terms of engagement, and she needed to do it quickly. She keyed her radio to the frequency used by the Special Forces team. Rodriguez's voice came through immediately, reporting that the convoy's survivors had taken cover and appeared to be calling for reinforcement. The original mission was still incomplete, and now Maria faced the additional challenge of protecting the ground team from both ground and air threats. But as she watched the enemy fighters positioning themselves for their next attack, something unexpected happened. Instead of fear or resignation, Maria felt a familiar sensation rising in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced during her most challenging training exercises, when the odds were impossible and the only option was to trust her skills completely.
It started as a smile, then grew into something more.
As the first fighter began its second attack run, diving toward the Apache with deadly intent, Captain Maria Santos did something that would become legend in military aviation circles. She laughed. It was not the laughter of hysteria or fear, but something far more dangerous. The laughter of a predator who had just realized that her prey had made a critical mistake. The enemy pilots had assumed that one helicopter against 3 fighters would be easy prey. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. Jake heard the laughter through their internal communication system and felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard that sound before, during their most intense combat missions, and he knew it meant that Maria had moved beyond normal tactical thinking into something approaching artistry. When Captain Santos laughed like that, impossible things became possible. The stage was set for a confrontation that would defy every rule of aerial warfare and create a legend that would be whispered in ready rooms and pilot lounges for decades to come. The second fighter jet screamed down from 12,000 feet, its pilot confident that one helicopter could not possibly threaten a modern interceptor aircraft. Captain Alexei Volkov had been flying fighters for 8 years, with kills against both ground targets and enemy aircraft. From his perspective, this engagement should last no more than 30 seconds. He was about to discover how catastrophically wrong he could be. Maria watched the fighters approach through the Apache's heads-up display, her mind calculating vectors and timing with machine-like precision. The pilot was making a classic mistake. He was committed to a high-speed attack run that would give him one brief opportunity to engage before his momentum carried him past the target. In a normal air-to-air engagement, this would be exactly the right tactic. Against an Apache helicopter flown by Maria Santos, it was suicide. As the fighter closed to 3 kilometers, Maria suddenly pulled the Apache into a maneuver that seemed to defy physics. She rolled the helicopter inverted while simultaneously pulling up, creating a corkscrew pattern that made her aircraft's position impossible to predict. The fighter pilot, committed to his attack run, found himself firing at empty air as the Apache spiraled away from his weapons track. But Maria was not content to simply evade. As the fighter roared past, she rolled the Apache upright and immediately began climbing in a tight spiral, using the helicopter's superior rate of climb to gain altitude rapidly. Jake worked frantically at his weapon systems, trying to acquire a lock on the fighter as it began to turn for another attack pass. The key to Maria's strategy was understanding the limitations of her opponents. Fighter jets were designed to engage targets at long range with sophisticated radar-guided missiles, or in close combat using cannon fire and heat-seeking weapons. But they had one critical vulnerability. They could not slow down enough to engage a maneuvering helicopter effectively without stalling their own aircraft. As Captain Volkov brought his fighter around for a second attack, he found the Apache directly in front of him, hovering at 8,000 feet with its nose pointed straight at his aircraft. For a moment, pilot and helicopter faced each other like gunfighters in an old western, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Maria smiled as she watched the fighter pilot's dilemma play out on her targeting display. He could not hover to engage her, and any attack run would carry him past the Apache before he could bring his weapons to bear effectively. She, on the other hand, could hold her position indefinitely while Jake worked to achieve a weapons lock. Volkov made his decision and dove toward the Apache, hoping to use his superior speed to overwhelm the helicopter's defenses. Maria waited until the last possible moment, then dropped the Apache like a stone, falling away from the fighter's attack while simultaneously launching another Stinger missile. This time, the missile found its mark. The fighter exploded in a brilliant fireball, its debris scattered across the mountain valley below. Captain Volkov never had time to eject. 2 down, 1 to go. But the remaining fighter pilot had been learning from his wingmen's mistakes. Major Dmitry Kozlov was the flight leader, a veteran with over 300 combat missions. He recognized that the conventional tactics were not working against this particular helicopter pilot, and he began to adapt his strategy accordingly. Instead of making high-speed attack runs, Kozlov began flying a wide orbit around the Apache, staying at maximum weapons range while looking for an opportunity to engage. He had radioed for reinforcements, but the nearest aircraft was still 20 minutes away. He needed to find a way to destroy the helicopter quickly before it could escape or complete whatever mission it was performing.
Maria recognized the change in tactics immediately.
The remaining pilot was more experienced than his wingmen, and he was not going to make the same mistakes they had. She needed to force him into close combat, where the Apache's advantages would be most pronounced. She began flying an erratic pattern, sometimes climbing rapidly, sometimes diving toward the canyon floor, always keeping the helicopter moving in unpredictable directions. Jake maintained constant communication with the Special Forces team on the ground, who reported that the convoy survivors had been eliminated and the primary mission was complete. Now the question was whether Maria and Jake could escape before enemy reinforcements arrived. But Maria had no intention of running. She had destroyed 2 enemy fighters in single combat, an achievement that would be considered impossible by most military analysts. The opportunity to complete a clean sweep was too tempting to pass up, especially when the alternative was allowing an enemy pilot to report her tactics to his superiors. Major Kozlov, for his part, was growing increasingly frustrated with his inability to achieve a clean shot on the Apache. The helicopter pilot seemed to anticipate his every move, always positioning the aircraft just outside his optimal engagement envelope. He decided to try a different approach. Instead of trying to engage the helicopter directly, he would force it down to lower altitude, where terrain would limit its maneuverability. He began a series of high-speed passes over the canyon, not trying to hit the Apache, but rather herding it toward the narrow confines of the valley floor. Maria recognized the tactic immediately and admired its cleverness. The fighter pilot was using the terrain as a weapon, trying to trap her in a position where his superior speed would become an advantage. But Maria had spent countless hours training in mountainous terrain, learning to use the landscape as both cover and weapon. As Kozlov made his next pass, she suddenly dropped the Apache into the canyon itself, flying between the rock walls at a height that would have been impossible for a fixed-wing aircraft to match. Kozlov followed, diving his fighter into the canyon in pursuit. This was exactly what Maria had been hoping for. The fighter pilot had committed himself to a low-altitude engagement where his speed advantage would be minimized, and his maneuverability would be severely limited by the canyon walls. Flying at maximum speed through the twisting canyon, Kozlov found himself in an impossible position. He could not slow down without stalling his aircraft, but at his current speed, he could not make the tight turns necessary to keep the Apache in sight. The helicopter, meanwhile, could stop, hover, and change direction at will, always staying just ahead of his weapons. Maria led the fighter deeper into the canyon, drawing him into increasingly narrow passages where the walls closed in on both sides. Jake watched their altitude and airspeed carefully, knowing that one mistake would send them crashing into the rocky canyon floor. But Maria flew with the precision of a surgeon, using every foot of available space to maintain just enough separation from the pursuing fighter. As they approached a sharp turn in the canyon, Maria suddenly executed a maneuver that would become legendary in military aviation circles. She brought the Apache to a complete stop and spun the helicopter 180 degrees, so that it was facing back down the canyon toward the approaching fighter. In the same motion, she dropped the aircraft below the level of the canyon walls, effectively disappearing from Kozlov's view. Major Kozlov, flying at over 400 miles per hour, found himself committed to a turn he could not make. The canyon walls loomed on both sides, and his fighter was too fast and too heavy to change course. In the few seconds he had to process what was happening, he realized that the helicopter pilot had maneuvered him into an impossible position. He tried to climb out of the canyon, but it was too late. The fighter's wings clipped the canyon wall, and the aircraft disintegrated in a massive explosion that echoed off the surrounding peaks. Major Kozlov died instantly, his aircraft scattered across the canyon floor in burning fragments. Maria climbed the Apache back to altitude, emerging from the canyon like a predator returning from a successful hunt. 3 enemy fighters had engaged her, and all 3 had been destroyed. It was an achievement that would have seemed impossible to any reasonable military analyst, and yet Jake had witnessed it all from the front seat of the Apache. As they flew back toward their base, Jake tried to process what he had just experienced. In his years as a weapons systems officer, he had participated in dozens of combat missions, but nothing had prepared him for what he had just witnessed. Maria had not simply defeated 3 enemy fighters. She had outflown them, outthought them, and ultimately destroyed them using tactics that seemed to belong more to the realm of legend than reality. The radio crackled with transmissions from their base, requesting status updates and mission reports. Word was already spreading through the chain of command that something extraordinary had happened in the mountains, that a single Apache helicopter had engaged multiple enemy fighters and emerged victorious. Maria keyed her microphone and delivered her after-action report in the same calm, professional tone she used for routine missions. But Jake could hear something else in her voice, a quiet satisfaction that came from having pushed herself and her aircraft to the absolute limits of their capabilities and emerged victorious. As they approached their forward operating base, Jake could see crowds of personnel gathering around the landing zone. Word of their engagement had spread quickly, and everyone wanted to see the helicopter crew that had achieved the impossible. Maria set the Apache down with her characteristic precision, the aircraft settling onto the dusty landing pad as gently as a bird. As the engines wound down and the rotor blades slowed to a stop, Jake realized that he had been part of something that would be remembered long after they were both gone. Military historians would study this engagement for decades, trying to understand how a single helicopter had defeated 3 modern fighter aircraft in air-to-air combat. But for Maria, it was simply another mission completed successfully. As she went through her post-flight checks, her demeanor was calm and professional, showing no sign of the incredible stress she had just endured. When asked about the engagement by the gathered personnel, she would only say that the Apache had performed exactly as designed, and that the enemy pilots had made several tactical errors. What she did not mention, and what Jake would never forget, was the sound of her laughter as she engaged the enemy fighters. It was not the laughter of someone who was afraid or desperate, but the laughter of a predator who had found worthy prey. It was the sound of a pilot who had discovered that the impossible was simply another word for something that had not been attempted by the right person. The maintenance crews would spend hours examining the Apache, looking for signs of damage from the engagement. They would find evidence of the violent maneuvers Maria had performed, stress fractures in the airframe, worn components in the flight controls, and burn marks from missiles that had passed too close. But the aircraft was still flyable, still capable of performing its mission. As the sun set over the mountains where 3 enemy fighters lay in smoking ruins, Maria Santos walked to her quarters to prepare her written report. She would describe the engagement in clinical terms, focusing on tactics and procedures rather than the emotional aspects of the combat. But Jake knew that something had changed during those minutes in the mountain canyon, something that would stay with both of them for the rest of their lives. They had seen what it looked like when skill, training, and raw courage combined to achieve something that should have been impossible. They had witnessed the birth of a legend, and they would carry that memory with them forever. The debriefing room at Forward Operating Base Charlie fell silent as Maria finished recounting the engagement. Around the table sat some of the most experienced military aviation professionals in the theater: flight commanders, intelligence officers, and senior pilots who had collectively accumulated thousands of combat missions. None of them had ever heard anything quite like the story Maria and Jake had just told. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the base commander, leaned back in her chair and studied the preliminary battle damage assessment reports. Reconnaissance drones had surveyed the crash sites, confirming the destruction of 3 enemy aircraft. Satellite imagery showed debris patterns consistent with Maria's description of the engagement. The evidence was overwhelming, but the achievement still seemed to defy rational explanation. Lieutenant General Robert Hayes, commander of all aviation assets in the region, had flown in specifically to conduct this debriefing. He was a man who had seen combat in 3 different wars, who had personally flown attack helicopters in some of the most dangerous missions of the past 2 decades. His reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by his reputation for brutal honesty in evaluating pilot performance. General Hayes had been skeptical when the initial reports reached his headquarters. The idea that a single Apache helicopter could defeat 3 fighter aircraft in air-to-air combat contradicted everything he knew about modern aerial warfare. Fighter jets were specifically designed to destroy helicopters, using their superior speed and long-range weapons to engage from distances where the helicopter could not fight back. But as Maria walked through her tactical decisions step by step, describing each maneuver and explaining the reasoning behind her choices, Hayes began to understand what had made the impossible possible. This was not a case of luck or enemy incompetence. It was a masterclass in tactical innovation, executed by a pilot who understood her aircraft's capabilities better than anyone had thought possible. The key insight that emerged from the debriefing was Maria's recognition that traditional air-to-air combat doctrine simply did not apply to her situation. Instead of trying to fight the enemy fighters on their terms, she had forced them to fight on hers. She had used the Apache's superior maneuverability and her own intimate knowledge of mountain flying to create engagement conditions that favored the helicopter. Jake supplemented Maria's account with technical details about weapons systems performance and electronic warfare measures. His calm professionalism provided an important counterpoint to what could have been dismissed as an incredible story. When 2 experienced combat veterans independently confirmed the same sequence of events, credibility increased dramatically. The intelligence implications of the engagement were equally significant. The presence of 3 modern fighter aircraft in an area where none were supposed to exist suggested that enemy capabilities had been seriously underestimated. The fighters had been well maintained and professionally flown, indicating access to sophisticated support infrastructure that intelligence analysts had not detected. Major Patricia Williams, the squadron intelligence officer, had been working around the clock to piece together the enemy order of battle. The wreckage recovery teams had found evidence that the aircraft were MiG Palmer, 2-9 fighters probably manufactured within the last 5 years. The pilot's equipment included advanced navigation systems and communication gear that suggested extensive training and support. But perhaps the most significant discovery came from intercepted enemy communications in the hours following the engagement. Radio traffic indicated panic and confusion among enemy commanders who could not understand how 3 of their best pilots had been shot down by a single helicopter. Some transmissions suggested that enemy forces were being withdrawn from advanced positions, apparently out of concern that other similar engagements might occur. The psychological impact of Maria's victory extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Enemy forces had been operating under the assumption that their air superiority gave them a decisive advantage over ground-based operations. The destruction of 3 fighters by a helicopter had shattered that assumption, forcing enemy commanders to reconsider their entire strategic approach. Word of the engagement spread rapidly through the military community, carried by pilots, crew chiefs, and intelligence analysts who understood the significance of what had occurred. Within days, Maria's call sign, Laughing Ghost, had become known throughout the theater of operations. The nickname referred both to her distinctive laughter during combat and to her apparent ability to vanish from enemy senses at critical moments. But fame brought its own challenges. Higher headquarters began pressuring Maria to participate in publicity efforts designed to boost morale throughout the military. She was invited to brief senior commanders, to participate in training videos, and to share her experiences with pilot trainees. Maria politely but firmly declined most of these requests, preferring to focus on operational flying rather than public relations. The technical aspects of her achievement attracted attention from aircraft manufacturers and military research organizations. Engineers from the Apache's manufacturer requested detailed debriefings, hoping to understand how their aircraft had been used in ways they had never anticipated. Military tacticians began developing new training programs based on Maria's innovations, trying to replicate her techniques with other pilots. However, attempts to recreate Maria's success in training exercises consistently failed. Other pilots, even highly experienced ones, could not achieve the same results when faced with simulated fighter attacks. The combination of skill, timing, and tactical intuition that had made her victory possible appeared to be unique to Maria herself. James Richardson, a military psychologist specializing in combat performance, interviewed Maria extensively as part of a study on exceptional achievement under stress. His findings suggested that Maria possessed an unusual combination of spatial intelligence, risk tolerance, and what he termed tactical creativity, the ability to develop innovative solutions to complex problems under extreme time pressure. Richardson's report noted that Maria's laughter during combat was not a sign of stress or inappropriate emotion, but rather indicated a state of what psychologists call flow, complete absorption in a challenging task where skills are perfectly matched to the difficulty of the situation. In this state, performance often exceeds normal limitations, and individuals report feeling as if they are operating on pure instinct. The months following the engagement brought a steady stream of missions for Maria and Jake. Their reputation preceded them, and ground commanders specifically requested their support for the most challenging operations. They participated in deep strike missions, combat search and rescue operations, and special forces insertions in heavily defended territory. Each mission added to the legend of the Laughing Ghost. Stories circulated about impossible shots made under fire, daring rescues completed against overwhelming odds, and tactical innovations that confounded both allies and enemies. Some of the stories were accurate accounts of actual events. Others had been embellished in the retelling, growing more dramatic with each iteration. Maria remained largely oblivious to her growing reputation, focusing instead on the technical aspects of her missions. She spent hours studying enemy tactics, analyzing intelligence reports, and working with maintenance crews to optimize her aircraft's performance. Her approach to combat flying was methodical and professional, guided by careful planning and thorough preparation. Jake, meanwhile, found himself in the unusual position of being the most credible witness to events that many people found difficult to believe. He was frequently asked to confirm details of their various missions, particularly the original fighter engagement that had started Maria's legend. His consistent accounts and obvious technical competence helped establish the credibility of even the most extraordinary stories. The enemy, for their part, appeared to have learned from their encounters with Maria. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy air operations had been significantly reduced in areas where the Laughing Ghost was known to operate. When enemy aircraft were detected, they maintained much greater distances from helicopter operating areas and showed increased caution when engaging any rotary wing aircraft. This change in enemy behavior had tactical implications that extended far beyond Maria's individual missions. Other helicopter crews found their operations less dangerous as enemy fighters became more reluctant to engage. Ground forces operating in areas where Maria had previously flown reported reduced enemy air attacks and increased freedom of movement. As her tour of duty neared its end, Maria was offered several opportunities to extend her deployment or accept positions that would keep her in combat operations. Promotions were available, along with assignments to prestigious units and advanced training programs. The military establishment clearly wanted to retain someone with her unique capabilities, but Maria surprised many by declining these opportunities. She had decided to return to the United States to serve as an instructor pilot, teaching the next generation of Apache crews. When asked about her decision, she explained that her experiences had taught her things that needed to be passed on to other pilots, techniques, and insights that could save lives and improve mission effectiveness. Her final mission in theater was a routine transport operation, ferrying supplies to a remote outpost. There was no combat, no dramatic engagement, no addition to her legend. Maria flew the mission with the same professional competence she brought to every flight, ensuring that critical supplies reached their destination safely and on schedule. As Maria and Jake prepared to leave the theater, their squadron held a ceremony recognizing their achievements. The formal citations mentioned successful mission completion rates, enemy aircraft destroyed, and lives saved. But the informal speeches from fellow pilots focused on something more intangible: the inspiration that came from watching someone push beyond the accepted limits of what was possible. Years later, military historians would analyze Maria's achievements in the context of aviation development and tactical evolution. Her techniques would be studied in staff colleges and incorporated into training curricula. The engagement with the three fighters would be cited as a classic example of how individual innovation could overcome technological disadvantages, but for the pilots who flew with her, Maria Santos would be remembered for something simpler and more profound. She had shown them that courage, skill, and determination could achieve things that seemed impossible. She had proved that the human element in warfare remained paramount, even in an age of increasingly sophisticated technology. The laughter that had become her trademark would echo in the memories of those who heard it. A reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, joy and confidence could triumph over fear and despair. It was the sound of someone who had found her calling and embraced it completely, who had discovered that the greatest achievements come from pushing beyond the boundaries of the possible. Maria Santos had become a legend, not because she sought fame or glory, but because she had the courage to laugh in the face of death and the skill to turn that laughter into victory. Her story would be told and retold for decades to come, inspiring future generations of pilots to reach for their own impossible achievements. The last sound 3 enemy pilots ever heard had become the first note of a legend that would never fade.